At dawn, the red cliffs of Petra ignite with light, stone catching fire beneath the rising sun. Shadows cling to the narrow passage of the sick, and the wind hums softly through canyons carved by forgotten hands. For centuries, these walls have watched the desert shift, the empires rise, the prayers fade into dust. Yet beneath their silence lies a question that few have dared to voice, one that, if true, would rewrite everything we believe about the dawn of faith itself. What if the story of Jesus, the story that shaped half the world, didn't begin in Jerusalem, but here, in the lost city of Petra? It sounds impossible, heretical, the kind of idea that scholars dismiss with a nervous laugh. But sometimes heresy is just history waiting to be heard, hidden beneath centuries of translation and conquest, buried under the weight of empire. There are traces, whispers in stone, that point southward, toward the Nabataeans, toward a place where prophets once walked and caravans carried frankincense instead of gospels. The stones of Petra remember more than they reveal. Temples once lined with altars face the rising sun, not the Holy Land. Ancient scripts etched into walls tell stories of sacrifice, of gods who died and were reborn. To walk here is to walk through a mirror of the sacred, familiar yet wrong in all the right ways. No official history book mentions Petra as a cradle of faith. No pulpit sermon connects its sandstone cathedrals to Bethlehem or Galilee. Yet, deep within these canyons, patterns begin to emerge, the kind that make archaeologists uneasy and believers whisper. If the sacred trail didn't start in Jerusalem, where did it lead before the world began to record? Some scholars think they know. And if they're right, then the foundations of Christianity may have been laid not on the hills of Judea, but beneath these red stones, glowing in the morning light. Petra breathes in silence, the kind that feels older than sound itself. Every archway, every carved facade, every hollow tomb stares outward like an unblinking eye, a witness to something the world has forgotten. The wind moves through empty corridors where once incense smoke curled toward the heavens. Steps carved into the living rock lead nowhere now, ending in shadow, as if the city itself were trying to erase its own path. They call it the rose-red city, half as old as time, but its color isn't what haunts you, it's the stillness, the sense that Petra is holding its breath, as if waiting for someone to ask the right question. Tombs line the valley like a procession of ghosts, each doorway larger than a man, each chamber cut with impossible precision. But for all their grandeur, no kings were buried here, no bones remain. It's as though the city built for death never received its dead. Scholars still debate who the Nabataeans truly were, traders, priests, architects of water and stone, but in Petra's heart, meaning feels deliberate. Every channel, every stair, every line carved into the cliffs points somewhere. Hidden beneath the decay is geometry, a pattern in the chaos. The city's main route winds east to west, mirroring the ancient descriptions of pilgrimage paths toward a holy house between the mountains. Some early travelers wrote of sacred processions that followed sunlight through narrow gorges, ending at an altar where water and fire met. That description fits Petra perfectly. Could these ruins be the real Jerusalem mentioned in the oldest Gospels, before Rome's wars and edicts rewrote the map of faith? It's a question most historians refuse to entertain. Yet here, among silent tombs and forgotten temples, the landscape itself whispers a challenge. If truth was ever carved into stone, perhaps it was here, waiting untouched, beneath centuries of sand and silence. History, for all its authority, is written on shifting sand, The maps we trust, the ones hanging in classrooms and printed in holy books, are only as truthful as the hands that drew them. And sometimes those hands were guided not by memory, but by power. Long before satellites and archaeology, the world knew its sacred geography by word of mouth. Scrolls, oral traditions, and travelers' tales told of a holy city east of the Jordan, near mountains that bled red at sunset. Ancient geographers like Ptolemy drew maps where the land of Judea stretched into Nabataea, its borders soft, fluid, uncertain. In some of those maps, the location of Jerusalem itself seems to drift eastward across the Dead Sea into the very deserts where Petra lies hidden. But how could a city so central to faith simply move? The answer perhaps lies in conquest. In 70 CE, the Roman legions stormed Jerusalem, razing its temple and slaughtering thousands. What survived was rubble, and a symbol too sacred to lose. When Emperor Hadrian later rebuilt the ruins as Aelia Capitolina, he did more than raise walls. He rebranded history. He renamed the land Palestina to sever its Jewish roots, and with it he erased the original city from maps, replacing it with one that fit Rome's new design. Over centuries, the old coordinates vanished, replaced by the version we know today. But in dusty manuscripts and travelers' accounts, strange hints remain of pilgrims searching for Jerusalem far to the south beyond the Salt Sea. They spoke of a holy mountain, of rock-hewn altars and desert sanctuaries. If the Romans erased and rebuilt Jerusalem, then what became of the city they buried beneath politics and stone? Could the real origin of the faith, the Jerusalem of the first believers, have survived quietly in the red canyons of Petra? History may not have lied outright. It may have simply obeyed its conquerors. The Nabataeans were never meant to vanish quietly. They were merchants of both earth and spirit, a people who built an empire not with armies, but with trade routes stretching from Arabia to Damascus, from the Red Sea to the shores of Judea. Their camels carried more than spices and incense. They carried stories, languages, and ideas. In their wake, cultures blended: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and the dialects of the desert, all meeting in the air like threads of incense smoke. Petra was their masterpiece, a crossroads of caravans and gods. But its builders were no strangers to the faiths of their neighbors. The Nabataeans spoke a dialect strikingly close to the Aramaic tongue that Jesus himself would have used. Their inscriptions, etched into the sandstone, contain words for Lord, Spirit, and life that echo eerily through early Christian scripture. Scholars studying these texts have noticed patterns, linguistic fingerprints, suggesting that the two cultures were not distant cousins, but close neighbors. The Nabataean pantheon, too, feels hauntingly familiar. Their chief god, Dushara, was symbolized by a cube-shaped stone, worshipped as an invisible, formless divinity who resided within the mountain. Surrounding deities included Alat, the mother goddess, and Al-Uzza, the bringer of light, names that later reappear, refracted in later Abrahamic faiths. The line between pagan and prophetic blurs here, as if Petra were a rehearsal for monotheism itself. Trade brought more than goods. It brought the exchange of meaning. The road between Judea and Nabataea was alive with pilgrims, prophets, and preachers, each carrying their own version of the truth. Perhaps this is why the Gospels, in their earliest oral forms, resonate with the desert's rhythm. Was Jesus' world more desert than temple, more caravan trail than city street? If so, the voice that echoed across Galilee may have first whispered among these cliffs, carried by the wind that still moves through Petra's red stone corridors, where language and faith once spoke the same tongue. The earliest Christians were wanderers, fugitives of faith, who fled not toward power but away from it. After the crucifixion, the Roman world turned hostile. To speak the name of Christ was to invite suspicion, exile, or death. So they ran not north to the cities of empire, but south into the wilderness. The desert became both punishment and sanctuary. History records fragments of their escape, communities vanishing into caves, families surviving off dew and roots, prayers whispered into the dry wind. Some fled into Egypt, others toward the rugged mountains of Edom and Nabataean, the lands that cradle Petra. In those years, the great city of stone still pulsed with trade, but beyond its gates stretched miles of empty gorges, dotted with dwellings carved into the cliffs, hidden, quiet, eternal. It was a place perfectly suited for those who sought to disappear. Archaeologists have found signs of early ascetic life scattered through the surrounding canyons. Crosses etched faintly into rock, symbols of fish and stars, fragments of oil lamps. They date centuries earlier than most known Christian monastic sites. Coincidence, perhaps, or a trace of those who fled here when belief itself was treason. The geography fits the legends too. Some ancient texts speak of a city of refuge among the Red Mountains, a sanctuary for those hunted for the word's sake. Could it be Petra? It lies directly on the ancient route between Jerusalem and the Sinai, a natural path of exile and survival. Imagine them here, followers of a crucified teacher, gathering at dusk within the shadows of the sick, their hymns echoing softly between the walls. No churches, no altars, no books, just faith, raw and trembling, hiding in the open. What if the first followers of Jesus hid here in these very caves beneath these same red cliffs, keeping alive a story that the world wasn't yet ready to hear? Not far beyond Petra's grand facade, past the worn steps of the treasury and into the upper ravines, the silence deepens into something almost sacred. There, carved high into the cliffs, archaeologists have found dwellings, small, austere, and purposeful. They are nothing like royal tombs or merchants' quarters. These are cells, monastic chambers, the kind of places built by people who chose to live with nothing but stone and faith. Inside, the air is cool and still. Soot marks on the ceilings suggest oil lamps once flickered here. Rough altars of uncut rock bear faint grooves, channels for melted wax or ritual oil. And on the walls, nearly erased by time, are symbols no one expected to find. The faint outline of a cross within a circle, the ichthys, the fish symbol of the earliest believers, and what some claim is a crude carving of a shepherd carrying a lamb. These carvings shouldn't exist, not this early and not this far from Jerusalem. Their presence forces uncomfortable questions. Who carved them? When? And why in a city that, according to the official record, was already fading by the time Christianity rose? Some historians argue they were made centuries later, perhaps by Byzantine pilgrims. Others are not so sure. Carbon dating of nearby soot suggests human activity here as early as the 1st and 2nd centuries. The very window, when the faith was still an outlaw creed. To the untrained eye, these caves are just remnants of solitude, but to those who know the language of symbols, they tell a story of exiles turned monks, of believers carving their devotion into the only canvas they had, the rock itself. If Petra's cliffs once sheltered prophets and fugitives, Perhaps these carvings are not random at all. Perhaps they are the last whispers of a community that dared to worship in secret, hidden not from God, but from history itself. To the untrained eye, Petra's ruins seem like an art gallery of stone, temples, facades, and tombs carved into crimson cliffs. But to those who study the heavens, Petra is something more precise. It is a map written in sunlight. Its monuments do not face the city or the stars by accident. They are aligned meticulously to something greater. Archaeologists began to notice the pattern when surveying the city's major structures: the Qasr al-Bint, the monastery, and the high place of sacrifice. Each faces a direction that seems to echo the same celestial rhythm: the sunrise of the spring equinox, the moment when light divides day and night in perfect balance. When the first rays break over the mountains, they pour directly into the sanctuaries, illuminating altars long cold and silent. That orientation mirrors an older tradition, one said to belong to Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Ancient records describe the first temple as facing east, so that at the equinox the sun would rise over the Mount of Olives, and its light would flood the inner court. The resemblance is not coincidence, it's design. Both sites, one in the green hills of Judea, the other in the red deserts of Edom, were built to mark the same cosmic moment: rebirth through light. But there is another layer to the mystery. Petra's main altar does not face Mecca, as later Islamic sanctuaries would, nor even true east. It faces a precise azimuth, the rising point of the equinox sun. In ancient faiths, that alignment symbolized divine balance, the meeting of heaven and earth. Petra's architects knew geometry as language, astronomy as faith. Could they have inherited this from a priesthood older than Israel itself? Petra's main altar aligns not with Mecca, but with the rising sun of the spring equinox, just like Solomon's temple. And if both were built to honor the same light, then perhaps their worship was once the same flame, scattered but never truly extinguished. High above Petra, where the cliffs open into windswept terraces, stands a plateau known as the high place of sacrifice. Here the stone itself becomes an altar, a vast table carved from the mountain, its edges darkened by centuries of ritual fire. The Nabataeans came here to offer incense and blood, smoke and prayer. They brought lambs and doves, wine and myrrh, gifts meant to bridge the gap between man and the unseen. The scent of burning resin once carried through the desert air, rising like a message no one could read. The echoes of these rituals linger in unsettling ways. The use of frankincense and myrrh, sacred resins mentioned throughout Hebrew scripture, was central to Nabataean worship. Their priests, dressed in linen and head coverings, performed purification rites with water drawn from cisterns below the cliffs. They sacrificed lambs at dawn, the hour when the desert light touched the altar's edge. Even the prayers, reconstructed from fragmentary inscriptions, invoke a single creator God. Merciful, all-seeing, enthroned in heaven. To the outside world, Petra was a city of traders, but to those who understood its inner sanctuaries, it was a city of priests. The parallels with early Hebrew and even Christian rites are too many to ignore. The cleansing water, the incense, the bread and wine offerings, the reverence for the Lamb. These were not mere coincidences of culture. They were shared symbols, woven through generations of belief. Were the Nabataeans echoing the religion that came before them, or did their rituals plant the seed for what would come after? The line is blurred like the horizon at dusk. Perhaps the faiths we see as separate were once one, a single ancient devotion fractured by language and empire? Were these echoes of an older religion or the roots of one? The wind still moves across the high place of sacrifice, carrying whispers of prayers that sound both foreign and strangely familiar. Before Petra was rediscovered by the Western world in 1812, it had already lived a dozen forgotten lives. Long after the Nabataeans vanished, the city's legend endured, not in maps, but in whispers. Medieval pilgrims spoke of a holy city in the rock, a place carved by God's own hand, somewhere east of the Jordan. In dusty manuscripts and travelers' journals, faint references survive of sanctuaries hidden among mountains where candles never went out and sacred chants echoed through hollow canyons. The strangest part is that many of these accounts predate the rediscovery of Petra by over 1,000 years. Some early Christian travelers wrote of making pilgrimage to a place they called Petros, the rock, a term that in Greek bears the same root as Petra. They described processions through narrow paths, offerings left in caves, and a monumental facade where the glory of the Lord once shone. Their records are fragmentary, sometimes dismissed as poetic allegory, yet the descriptions match the landscape perfectly. The winding sick, the cliffs streaked with iron-red veins, the tombs shaped like temples. Archaeologists have even uncovered Byzantine-era crosses carved into Petra's gateways, faint but deliberate. They suggest that, for centuries after Rome's fall, this lost city was anything but forgotten. Pilgrims came quietly, leaving behind symbols of faith that blended the sacred and the ancient. But why would early pilgrims come here unless they believed something sacred happened here? The official Jerusalem was already revered, yet some still journeyed south through the heat, through the wilderness, to kneel before the city of stone. Perhaps they were chasing a rumor older than Scripture, one that said salvation was born not in a stable, but in a desert shrine carved by forgotten hands. Maybe the pilgrims of old weren't lost at all. Maybe they were following a road the rest of history forgot. Every spring in Jerusalem, a miracle is said to occur, a flame that appears spontaneously inside the church of the Holy Sepulchre, symbolizing the resurrection light of Christ. For centuries, the holy fire has drawn thousands of worshipers, its origins wrapped in mystery and faith. But deep in Petra's past, among its ruins and altars, another fire once burned, one that might hold the key to where this ritual truly began. The Nabataeans were masters of sacred flame. Their high altars and inner chambers show traces of controlled fire rituals, incense burned in rhythmic offerings, lamps lit in circular formations, and ceremonial flames rekindled at dawn to mark renewal and divine presence. Some carvings even depict priests carrying torches through the mountain passages during equinox festivals, when light returned to balance. Centuries later, Christian monastics settled near these same cliffs, keeping their own vigil fires. Archaeological residues of wax, oil, and soot show that these flames were not for warmth or light, but for worship. And among early Christian writings found in the region, a few mention a fire of faith that cannot be quenched, which rises from the tomb as from the rock itself. Could this be coincidence or continuity? The parallels are unsettling. A sacred flame emerging from stone, pilgrims lighting candles from a divine source, the belief that light renews life itself. If the Nabataeans' desert rituals fused with the devotion of early Christians, the holy fire may have begun not in the marble chapels of Jerusalem, but in Petra's tombs, where death and rebirth were carved into the very walls. Could the miracle of the holy fire, still practiced today, have begun in Petra's tombs? Perhaps what burns each year in Jerusalem is not a new flame at all, but the last surviving spark of a fire first kindled in the desert beneath the watchful red cliffs of the ancient city of stone. Every so often, history meets a heretic, not of faith, but of thought. In the last century, a handful of historians and archaeologists began whispering what few dared to publish: that Petra, not Jerusalem, might have been the first holy city of Christianity. The idea was academic dynamite, a theory too dangerous for institutions built on centuries of certainty. Among them was a British biblical geographer who noticed the orientation of early churches and mosques. Many pointed not toward Jerusalem, but toward Petra. His maps revealed an unsettling pattern. Around the same time, a Middle Eastern archaeologist documented early crosses and monastic dwellings in Petra's cliffs, artifacts that didn't fit the accepted timeline. When he proposed Petra as an original Christian refuge, his research funding was quietly revoked. His papers vanished from conferences. Within months, his name disappeared from university rosters. It wasn't the first time. In the 1980s, another scholar published a study comparing Nabataean religious symbols to early Christian iconography. He suggested that the shift from stone worship to spiritual faith may have begun in Petra's mountains. Church-affiliated reviewers labeled his work revisionist myth, and the journal pulled the article within weeks. Even mentioning Petra became a kind of academic taboo, a phrase that could end a career. Why such hostility? Perhaps because the theory doesn't just question geography, it questions ownership. If Petra, not Jerusalem, was the earliest center of worship, then the spiritual lineage of three major religions would need rewriting. It would mean that the world's holiest narratives began not in a walled city, but in an open desert, in a place the church never claimed. When one scholar mentioned Petra in his research, he was quietly removed from his position. History, it seems, guards its secrets not only with time, but with silence. Beneath the sands of southern Jordan, evidence still whispers, quiet, stubborn, and impossible to dismiss. Over the past few decades, researchers have uncovered fragments of inscriptions in Nabataean ruins bearing unmistakably Christian symbols: crosses, fish, and short Aramaic phrases invoking the Lord of Light. What makes them remarkable is not their design, but their age. Some of these markings, etched into sandstone near Petra's outskirts, have been dated to the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, decades before the first formal churches were built in Rome or Constantinople. If authentic, they would place Christian presence in Petra almost at the dawn of the faith itself. One inscription, found in a small tomb chamber, bears a crude cross flanked by two letters that appear to form the name Yeshua. Another, discovered deep in a canyon dwelling, contains the phrase, "He lives among the rocks." The syntax matches early Aramaic Christian prayers, the kind spoken before Greek translations reshaped the Gospels. Yet the official record remains skeptical. The dating methods are debated, the context downplayed. Each find is labeled ambiguous or misinterpreted. Still, the evidence grows. Pottery fragments bearing Chi symbols, oil lamps with cross engravings, even remnants of plastered niches that resemble miniature apses, all buried within Nabataean architecture. Their presence suggests a cultural overlap that history books never mention. If these carvings are genuine, Christianity may have been born hundreds of kilometers south of where we thought. The idea unsettles both theologians and archaeologists because it challenges The neat narrative of spiritual succession. It hints that the faith's first prayers may have echoed through stone corridors long before cathedrals rose in Europe. Maybe the story didn't start in Jerusalem's temple courtyards after all. Maybe it began in the Red City of Petra, where belief was carved into stone and faith found refuge in the desert's silence. By the middle of the 2nd century, the land once called Judea had become a graveyard of revolts. The Romans had crushed rebellion after rebellion, but one final uprising, the Bar Kokhba revolt, ignited in 132 CE. It was the last cry of a people refusing to be erased. For 3 bitter years, the rebels held out against the empire's might. When it ended, Rome answered not with peace, but with obliteration. Jerusalem was wiped from the map. Every stone of the temple was torn down, every trace of Jewish life uprooted. The survivors were scattered, their land renamed Syria Palestina, a calculated insult to sever memory from geography. And from the ashes, Emperor Hadrian built something new, Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony dedicated to Jupiter. Where the temple once stood, he erected statues of Roman gods. Where prayers once rose to heaven, the smell of sacrifice to foreign deities filled the air. But perhaps destruction wasn't the end. It was transformation. When the empire remade Jerusalem, it also remade history. For a faith still in its infancy, one that had grown from Judea's soil, but now spread across distant lands. The loss of its physical center was devastating. Without a homeland, believers needed a symbol, a place to fix their faith upon. And so, in the empire's shadow, new maps appeared. The holy city was redrawn, its coordinates redefined. The old Jerusalem was forgotten, its name and location overwritten by imperial decree. The new one, the Roman one, would become the only one allowed to exist. What if the Romans didn't just destroy a city, they relocated a faith? If Petra had once been the sanctuary of the early believers, that connection would have been dangerous. Easier to move the story than to explain the ruins. Easier to build a new Jerusalem than to admit the old one lay buried in the red desert stone. The idea sounds unthinkable, that one of the world's most sacred geographies might have been physically shifted on the map. Yet in the wake of Rome's conquests, such manipulation was common. To control a people, the empire first controlled their memory. If Petra truly held the remnants of an older worship, temples aligned to ancient rites, monastic carvings from forbidden sects, then Rome had every reason to bury it under new names, new myths, and new borders. The relocation hypothesis suggests that the holy city was not simply destroyed, but moved, its identity transferred from one site to another to consolidate imperial power and religious unity. Aelia Capitolina, the Roman Jerusalem, was built atop an empty hill infused with sacred significance by decree. Pilgrims would travel there, guided by scripture edited under imperial influence, never realizing that the physical landscape of their faith had changed. Such shifts weren't rare. Empires often transplanted holy centers to neutralize rebellion. Egypt's gods rebranded under Rome, Babylon's ziggurats claimed as trophies of Jupiter. Why not do the same for a fledgling movement like Christianity? The timing aligns too neatly. As Petra declined in the 2nd century, the newly Romanized Jerusalem rose. Early church fathers, writing from faraway cities, described a rebuilt Jerusalem where none had stood before. Some letters even speak of confusion, of pilgrims uncertain where to go. Yet the narrative soon stabilized. The official Jerusalem became the only acceptable truth, enshrined by those who survived under Rome's favor. Could the greatest relocation in religious history have gone completely unnoticed? Perhaps not unnoticed, merely unquestioned. Over time, the desert grew quiet and the memory of the Red City faded. But somewhere beneath the silence of Petra's canyons, the stones still face the same sunrise they did 2,000 years ago, waiting for someone to ask why. There are some questions that start as whispers, the kind that slip quietly between archaeology and belief, questions that few dare to follow. One of them begins with a compass. In the mid-20th century, researchers studying the ruins of early Islamic and Christian sites noticed something strange. The earliest mosques and monasteries didn't point toward modern-day Jerusalem or Mecca. Their qiblas, the sacred direction of prayer, seemed to aim instead toward the deserts of southern Jordan, toward Petra. Satellite measurements and field surveys confirm the anomaly. Mosques built during the first century of Islam, from China to North Africa, were aligned several degrees off the modern Meccan axis, tracing a line that intersected Petra's mountains. Even some of the oldest Christian monasteries of the Levant share this same orientation, their chapels and altars facing the same distant horizon. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Historians proposed dozens of explanations: compass errors, miscalculations, or shifting theological standards. But the precision of the alignments told another story. If both early Christians and Muslims looked to the same desert mountain when they prayed, it suggests a shared point of reverence, an older spiritual geography that both inherited. Why Petra? Because before it was a ruin, it was a beacon, a city of pilgrimage, of trade, of divine alignment. Its temples mirrored the equinox sun. Its altars crowned the mountain. For centuries, caravans followed its light like a compass in stone. So why did the first mosques and monasteries all point to the same desert mountain? Maybe because memory outlives maps. Maybe, long before theology divided the faithful, the compass of devotion still pointed to the same place. The cradle where light met stone and where faith first learned to face the dawn. Across the ancient Near East, the lines between religions were never as sharp as modern maps make them appear. In the desert, faiths overlapped like echoes, one fading as another began, their rituals blending in the heat and dust. Long before doctrines hardened, the people of the sands worshipped in ways that would feel strangely familiar to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. They washed their hands before prayer, faced sacred directions marked by stars or mountains, and offered incense at dawn to greet the sun, not as a god, but as a sign of divine order. They built shrines from unhewn stone, believing the divine preferred what human hands had not shaped. They fasted to purify, gave alms to the poor, and retreated into silence to find truth in solitude. All three faiths would later inherit these same gestures, each claiming them as revelation, though their roots were older than any scripture. Petra stood at the center of that exchange, a spiritual crossroads where caravans from Damascus, Medina, and Jerusalem met. Here, Jewish traders shared wells with Arab pilgrims, and Christian hermits carved prayers into Nabataean walls. Archaeological layers show that temples once dedicated to Dushara were later recarved into churches and then into early Islamic oratories. The same stone, the same orientation, only the names of God changed. Petra might not just be the birthplace of one religion, but the cradle of three. It was here, perhaps, that faith first learned its language of light and direction, of cleansing and sacrifice. Before doctrine drew borders, There was only the desert, vast, timeless, and holy. In that silence, every faith began the same way. With a single gesture, a body turning toward the rising sun, and a prayer whispered into the wind. For 2,000 years, the story of the empty tomb has anchored the heart of Christianity, the symbol of victory over death, the promise that light can rise from darkness. Yet what if that story didn't begin in Jerusalem at all? What if its setting, the tomb, the stone, the desert morning, came from a place older, more forgotten, carved deep into the red rock of Petra? Petra is a city of tombs, but not of death. Its chambers are hollow, clean, and eternal, built not to hold bodies, but to preserve memory. Each facade is a silent sermon about resurrection, transformation, and the endurance of spirit. The Nabataeans believed the soul passed through stone, reborn in light, a belief echoed centuries later in the language of the Gospels. The very idea of emerging from a rock-hewn tomb into dawn may have begun here, long before the Christian faith gave it new meaning. Perhaps Petra was never the site of a crucifixion or a burial, but of a beginning, a metaphor born from exile. When early believers fled persecution, this desert sanctuary became their refuge, their symbol of survival. The resurrection may not have meant an empty grave, but the rebirth of hope itself, faith rising from ruins, light returning to those driven into darkness. What if the resurrection story began here, not as myth, but as metaphor for exile? In the silence of Petra's tombs, the first followers might have found their parable carved in stone, that even when the world buries you, belief can still rise. The rocks of Petra never yielded bodies. They yielded stories, ones that outlived the empires that tried to erase them. Maybe the empty tomb was never meant to prove what was lost, but to remind us that truth, like faith, cannot be confined to one place or one map. Every revelation has a price. To question sacred geography, to suggest that Petra, not Jerusalem, may hold the roots of faith, is to challenge the foundations on which billions stand. Such ideas do not simply threaten doctrine, they threaten identity. Because faith is more than belief, it is belonging. And to move its birthplace is to move the heart of the believer. Throughout history, inconvenient truths have met the same fate: buried, denied, or rewritten. Empires decide what is remembered. Religions decide what is sacred. The rest is left to dust. Archaeologists who stumble upon contradictions learn this lesson quickly. A single stone can rewrite scripture, and that makes it dangerous. Perhaps that is why Petra's evidence, its alignments, its inscriptions, its whispers, remains at the margins of scholarship. It doesn't fit, it doesn't behave, it refuses to stay silent. But truth, even when buried, does not die. It waits. It lingers in the shadows of forgotten valleys, carved into walls that outlast kings. Maybe the world isn't ready to face what these stones could mean, that the story of salvation may have been shaped by geography, politics, and survival, as much as by divine design. Still, one can't help but wonder, if belief is strong enough to move mountains, could it also have moved its own birthplace? Maybe the truth didn't disappear. It was buried under centuries of faith. And perhaps that's the greatest mystery of all, that we've been walking through the ruins of our own beginnings, mistaking the echo for the voice, the reflection for the source. The cost of knowing isn't disbelief. It's awakening. And once you hear the whisper of truth beneath the stones, it's impossible to unhear it, Twilight falls on Petra like the closing of an ancient book. The sun dips behind the red cliffs and shadows lengthen along the Sek, that narrow winding canyon where wind and silence share the same voice. The narrator walks alone, each step echoing softly against the sandstone walls. The air is cooler now, but heavy with memory. Every surface seems alive with what it remembers. The brush of pilgrims' hands, the faint scorch of ritual fires, the murmur of prayers that no language can fully recover. Here, silence is not absence. It's presence, the kind that listens, the kind that waits. You can almost hear the faint hum of centuries, as though the cliffs themselves are breathing. The treasury looms ahead, half lit by the last glow of the desert sun. Its facade looks less like architecture and more like a revelation, something carved not for the living, but for time itself. In the fading light, its details blur and soften, and you can imagine it speaking in a voice older than any scripture. Remember, Petra's stones do not argue. They do not prove or deny. They simply endure, holding within them whatever fragments history tried to erase. Maybe faith began here, or maybe it only passed through. But as the wind whips down the Seek, carrying grains of red dust that sparkle briefly in the dying light, you can feel the question still pulsing in the air. If stones could speak, what would these red cliffs confess? Would they tell of prophets who fled into the desert, of rituals turned into myths? Or would they only whisper what we already know, that the truth, once buried, never truly dies? It only changes its shape, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Night has settled fully now. The stars appear one by one, cold and infinite above the valley of stone. In their pale light, Petra seems less a city than a memory, a monument to everything time tried to forget. The wind threads through the canyons like a ghostly choir, and somewhere far off a single owl calls, a reminder that even in silence, something watches, something endures. History will go on debating, of course. Scholars will argue over inscriptions and alignments. Priests will defend the maps they inherited, and skeptics will demand proof. Yet standing here among ruins older than argument, proof feels irrelevant. Petra doesn't need to prove anything. It is the proof that belief, like water, leaves traces even after the river dries. Maybe this place was never meant to confirm miracles, only to mirror them. Maybe every civilization builds its Petra, a sanctuary carved from what it fears to lose. Because in the end, faith isn't measured in relics or ruins, but in the persistence of wonder, the human need to look at stone and see something more than stone. The desert does not lie, it simply forgets. It buries stories, then waits for us to uncover them again, just long enough to remember how fragile memory is. As the last wind of the night sweeps through the canyon, the narrator turns back one final time. The cliffs glow faintly under the stars, their color muted but eternal. In that stillness, the truth feels less like a revelation and more like an echo, not shouting, just waiting. Faith leaves no fossils, only echoes, carved in stone, waiting to be heard again.